Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest, Ellen Carrillo, has written a new book from the Modern Language Association called The MLA Guide to Digital Literacy. The book addresses a chronic issue with web-based digital content: how to gauge credibility, authority, and bias of digital sources. The issues here aren't new. Ever since we started publishing to the web, there have been tactics for verifying content credibility. But over the years, the sheer volume of content published to the web, along with rapidly changing technology, the introduction of the social web, and the many ways people are gaming the system, are causing information professionals to perpetually adjust their strategies for tracking and evaluating the digital content marketplace. It's not hyperbole to say, indeed many are already saying so, that the amount of disinformation, bias, and other kinds of manipulated digital content on the web are serious threats to our democracy. And that very issue plays a key role behind the scenes in Ellen Carrillo's book, where it's ever more important for students to understand what digital literacy is and the skills necessary to achieve it, not only for their post-secondary research, but to remain informed citizens. In this third episode of our four-part series, Ellen, who is Associate Professor and Writing Coordinator at the University of Connecticut, talks about how the checklist approach to verifying online content doesn't quite go far enough, why it's important to remember the media is not the enemy, and whether fake news is a content problem, a technology problem, or both. You note in the guide that teaching human judgment is difficult, but with the abundance of information available to us, using certain techniques obviously to navigate it is very important. But nevertheless, you don't put a whole lot of stock in sort of some of the checklist approaches. Some of the acronyms might be CRAP or CARS, Accord, and so on. Can you talk about these checklists and why you think they don't go quite far enough? And then how your book is, as you say, a more or nuanced approach to teaching digital literacy. And then finally, why is that nuance necessary?
Sure. I should start by saying that no method is foolproof. I have nothing against these kinds of checklists. They are trying to get
Mhm.
at many of the issues I've mentioned, credibility and bias and so on. But I've seen how they've let students down. Students will apply them and do everything right according to the checklist, and the source will pass the test. But when I take a look at the source, I can see that it's not credible. And I think the nuance that the guide tries to provide is in the form of context. The approach the guide offers, which is called lateral reading, and I should say that that's not my own approach. It was introduced a couple years ago by Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew at Stanford University. This approach allows people to consider the source, the issue or question or authority within a larger context. While I think these checklists often compel us to look at these bits out of context. So if you're only looking at the source, which is largely what the checklists ask you to do, how can you really tell if it is credible if you have no context or larger framework or other piece on the subject to compare it to? How can you tell if the author is credible if you aren't going to other sites to look up that person? Someone might be an authority in one area and not another. But until you start moving away from the source and create some context around it, that's hard to know. And so the nuance comes in there.
Mhm.
Lateral reading, moving beyond the single source and reading laterally across the web to corroborate or cross check what that source says. My nuanced approach also comes in the form of how I organized the book and how I conceived of it as more than just a series of strategies or lessons. This book educates students on why it is important to be digitally literate. And so its approach is more nuanced in that way as compared to some other handbooks that just offer practical lessons.
Okay. Sadly, you mentioned in your first chapter, which defines digital literacy, and I say sadly because that you actually have to actually come out and say this. You say that media is not the enemy. I'm just curious, did you ever think you'd need to write those words? And why is this now so important to point out?
So I think there's this sense that media outlets and journalists are out to get certain people and create false news stories. And for the most part,
Mhm.
I just don't think that is true. Sure, there are pockets of this, But again, for the most part, journalists are following their code of ethics in how they locate sources and report news. And I'm excited that there has been a recent move toward educating the public about journalists and how they do their work, what's involved in this. And all of this is also making its way into curricula. And I think it's important that we are educated about this. So, for example, sometimes people assume that when a journalist cites an anonymous source, that source doesn't really exist. But an anonymous source cannot be made up. There is really a source who requested to remain anonymous. And that's just one example. And there are many others, including the amount of time and effort that journalists put into corroborating sources. And the public is largely unaware of this. And so, this kind of education about journalism and how journalists do their work complements digital literacy education really nicely. And it's very important. Skepticism of all media is a real problem, and it can lead to people not wanting to participate in a democracy because they feel so overwhelmed by skepticism. And that's not good either. So, giving people tools that can help them figure all of this out can serve as an antidote to this sort of skepticism. And recent research from the American Press Institute indicates that education or transparency about media and journalistic practices has a positive effect. It actually helps increase trust in the media. And I think we need to focus on that because we don't want people to become so skeptical that they decide to separate themselves totally from the democratic process.
Right. Yeah. I happen to follow a lot of journalists on Twitter, for example, and it's been really fascinating to see, I guess, almost as a reaction in terms of sort of defending their own work, how they've begun to the extent that they can on a social platform, but they've begun to explain how they've arrived at some of their the conclusions in their stories without obviously revealing sources, but they're talking more and more about how they put a story together in terms of the number of sources they interviewed and how much work that they put into it and how long it took them. And so there is this sort of growing sense on the journalist part, it seems like, that they're now explaining more about what they do, just sort of to help folks understand that they're not guided by their own biases or whatever in their reporting.
Right, right. And that kind of education is wonderful. And I think it can go hand in hand with these digital literacy skills
Hmm.
that we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've also online seen comments from people that fake news, for example, is a content problem, not a technology problem. But I feel like technology still plays a huge role, especially in how it enables the spread of that kind of content. Social platforms, for example, famously have a hands-off approach to content or are really slow to act with controversial content. The ability to personalize your content also plays a part. I'm wondering what role, if any, do you think technology plays in the spread of questionable content?
I agree that technology plays a huge role
Yeah.
in the fake news problem precisely because it allows fake news to spread so rapidly. And while it would be easy to blame this spread on bots, research is beginning to show that people spread it just as much, if not more, than bots. And research
Right.
also shows that people often don't even read something before they send it. And so it's both a technology issue and the fact that people are just mindlessly passing on whatever they receive without taking the time to read it, let alone verify it.
Right. So I'm wondering, I mean, you've talked a little bit about this already, but I'm wondering if we could dig a little bit more into sort of reading laterally concept. What are some of the ways your book counsels readers on conducting online research? And the idea of reading laterally, if you could define it once again and why that's a good strategy. And then in addition to that, what are a couple of other important strategies you would recommend that students learn?
Sure. So reading laterally involves reading across the web from site to site
Yep.
rather than vertically or down a single source in order to efficiently and effectively assess the credibility of a source. And educators Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew from Stanford University introduced this term and approach after they conducted a study of 3 groups of people: professional fact checkers, Stanford undergraduate students, and historians with PhDs. And they chose historians because they work so regularly with sources. And so they gave these participants digital sources that address social and political issues and asked them to evaluate them in various ways. Then they watched how they did so. And they found that the undergraduates and historians took the traditional vertical approach. They remained tethered to the single source or site and looked at it closely, considering the different elements on the source itself. So they looked at the website and they noticed what other kinds of sources it cited. Were these peer-reviewed sources? Were these sources relevant? Who published the site? What kind of evidence does it include? And so they really stayed on that one site. On the other hand, the professional fact checkers immediately left the source, moving laterally across the web to assess its credibility and to engage in the other tasks that they were asked to engage in. They opened new tab after tab to cross-check, to corroborate the one source. And ultimately, the fact checkers most efficiently and successfully completed the task. And the point is that they moved away from the source and outward toward other sources. And this allowed the fact checkers to capitalize on what the web has to offer, a seemingly limitless amount of other sources to use for the purpose of cross-checking. And I think this approach is really helpful, not only because I have seen other approaches like checklists fail, but also because this is a digitally specific reading strategy. And research shows that students lack these. And so this is what I would offer students. In several studies, including the one conducted by Weinberg and McGrew, students are largely reading digital sources as they do print sources. Not only are they not opening new tabs, as did the professional fact checkers, they aren't often clicking on hyperlinks, which can be another valuable resource that can connect students to more relevant information and provide additional background and context for what they are reading. And so teaching students digitally specific reading strategies, such as the importance of lateral reading and clicking hyperlinks, can go a long way. Again, I think instructors assume students do this, but the research shows us that they don't. They need to be taught how to read in a digital environment and how to make use of the tools available to them in that environment.
You just heard from Ellen Carrillo, author of a new book published by the MLA called The MLA Guide to Digital Literacy. Ellen is Associate Professor and Writing Coordinator at the University of Connecticut. Join us next week for our final episode in this series when Ellen and I discuss how to read laterally, whether authority even exists online anymore, and the role bias plays in digital literacy. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist Mark Dirks and digital media assistant Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.